All right. We have our guest, Mr. Russell. Thank you so much for joining us right back. As I mentioned, we were talking about the Gulf states and the role of Gulf states, and if there is a possibility of any back channel negotiations that can take place as of now with the aggression still ongoing.
In the best of all possible worlds, it seems to me that the answer is yes, that of course the Gulf states are, of course, and the Omanis in particular, have always shown themselves to be very helpful as interlocutors between us and the Iranians. But we're in a circumstance, or we appear to be in a circumstance today, where it's not clear what the Trump administration would be willing to negotiate about. In other words, we've had these ongoing meetings over the last couple of weeks between Iranians and Trump's envoys. And if I was on the Iranian side, I think I could make a pretty good case that the Americans have not been negotiating in good faith. In other words, they were never having the discussions with the idea that they would take yes from the Iranians and have some kind of agreement. So then we have President Trump's own statements, of course, in which he, after the shooting started, he said, well, we're for regime change and we'll do it whatever it takes. And if you're on the Iranian side of this equation, it's not clear what the basis can be for discussions from the enemy who is demanding your unconditional surrender, or appears to be demanding your unconditional surrender, and then to change the regime by making these attacks about regime change. The circumstance has been created, of course, the understandable circumstance has been created, that the Iranians will fight to the last man, so to speak. In other words, it's not clear what you're not going to have the members of the Guard, the Revolutionary Guard and the Council of Guardians sitting down with Americans to negotiate their surrender. That's just not going to happen. So this raises the uncomfortable sort of reality of the question, which is that if you can't change the regime by dropping bombs on them, then how long does the war go on, and what does the end of the war look like, and what is the off-ramp? And that's the sort of unknown question, right? How long does this go on?
Right.
And of course, as I said, one of the limiters is when the Americans and the Israelis and the Iranians, of course, run low on ammunition. But when you're fighting a war or launching bombs and missiles at the other side and demanding their complete surrender as the sort of condition for conflict termination, it doesn't give the other side much of an incentive to stop fighting, right? And I should hasten to add that if one looks at this in an historical context, air power and bombs have never resulted in any regime change or the toppling of a government that I know of. So this was an unrealistic, sort of expectation. I think that the Israeli hope, of course, which they, I think, have sold to President Trump, is that, again, the country will start coming apart at the seams and there'll be internal instability, and that the Iranians themselves, that is to say, the people of Iran, will somehow rise up and topple the regime. That's the only off-ramp that, at least if one takes President Trump at his word, this is the off-ramp for the termination of the war, which I think is unrealistic, but that's me talking.
Right, and talking of Khamenei, he's someone who had expanded the clerical class, and he had built the paramilitary revolutionary guard. Do you think we will see any kind of reaction from the proxies in and around the region?
Well, yes, I think the short answer is yes, because, as I've said, Iran has, in some ways, a more diversified toolkit in terms of the things at its disposal to be able to use in the conflict once they don't have any more long-range missiles at their disposal. And as I said, because of this, again, this demand on regime change, the Iranians are going to the incentive have the incentive to, again, draw upon the means at their disposal that includes the use of proxies. It includes the use of asymmetric warfare. And as I said, we in the United States and the Israelis like to sort of remind ourselves how great our systems are, and look at all the gun camera footage of things that are being blown up, and you know, the war can come to you in ways that you don't anticipate, and I hope that this doesn't happen. But if I was in Iran's shoes in this kind of an interaction, I would be looking at all means that were available to me to defend myself and to attack my enemies. And oh, by the way, the Iranians gave every indication in the weeks leading up to this attack that that's what they were going to do. They were not going to sort of sit back and take this, and they were going to respond with every means at their disposal, which meant, of course, attacks on the Gulf states, attacking American bases, and so it's a sort of desperately bad situation. There's no other way to describe it.
And when we talk of Khamenei, he's not just like the Iranian, he was not just the Iranian supreme leader. He was also he was considered the leader of the Muslims all around the world. What kind of consequences does that mean for in a global context with the death of Khamenei?
Right. So it's a great question, of course, that's the problem when you ask professors these questions. They give you these sort of long-winded answers, which I'm sorry about, but you did ask, and so the Islamic Republic in Iran and the Iran Revolution was meant to provide Muslims around the world with, as you say, an example of a government that would balance the requirements of religion with secular governance, guided, of course, by Islam, right? And this was deemed to be, and this was the not the first, but certainly the most successful of these Islamic revolutions that consolidated power into an actual real political system. But of course, what happened in that system is that the regime became sort of unresponsive to the people and created these sort of security sector organizations that, if their press releases had been true, by which I mean if the peoples of Iran had been seized by the revolutionary fervor, the rhetoric of the revolution, so to speak, they would have been signed on to this idea of the fusion between Islam and the state, so to speak, which is what the Islamic Revolution was supposed to signify. And Khomeini, in particular, when Khomeini came to power, this was a big part of his message, which was to spread the sort of theology of the revolution as far and wide. And I think the net result of this was a failure. By which I mean that Muslims around the world were never seized by the Khomeini-like rhetoric of the revolution. And the regime itself, as I said, grew to sort of rely on heavy-handed security sector organizations to maintain its hold on power. And I think it's sort of recognized in the industry, so to speak, by which I mean the industry of academia and the policy community, is that the revolution failed in that part of its mission, which, as I said, was to convert, or not convert, but sort of consolidate the sort of the strands of political Islam into this workable sort of system. It's never sort of achieved that sort of widespread acceptance. So it's hard to say, hard to see how Khamenei is seen as this sort of globally significant religious figure. I don't think he ever really achieved that. He never achieved the sort of the vision of the regime as it had been expressed by Khomeini. So,
Absolutely, and yes, and just talking about the regime, because what we see visuals from right now is that you have the Iranians coming out with flags. I mean,
yeah.
Of course, Trump did say that take over or remove the regime and take over. He tried to put that context after announcing that he's dead. But do you think that has backfired? And with the Iranians, like, it doesn't seem like with the visuals that they would want to go for take over. It looks like you see this kind of mourning of the Iranians with the visuals.
Well, it's an unknown, of course. We're in this sort of period of and I think the real question, the correct question, which you have answered, or you have asked, which is the most important one, which is what is the reaction of the Iranian people going to be to the assassination? Let's be clear about this. He's been murdered. The United States, Israelis have murdered their leader, right? And of course, try to put yourself in their shoes. What would the reaction of Indians be if Prime Minister Modi was, heaven forbid, was murdered, or if President Trump was murdered? The people would be outraged, of course. And so, as unpopular as the regime apparently is, and I don't know how it could be conceived of as being popular given the force that the regime has had to use to put down the internal protests. And let's also not forget, and your viewers should also be aware, that the Israelis and the United States have been working hard to destabilize Iran from the inside and with their intelligence services. I don't think there's been any question about that. Now, but the unknown question is, again, well, what does the internal cohesion of the country today actually look like? And I don't have the answer to that. This is only the Iranians that are there can tell us. And I also think that it's a pipe dream. I was listening to various commentators on the news networks today saying how the United States needs to be identifying the leaders of the opposition and working with them. And, it's all this sort of idea that we in the United States and in the West, can somehow figure out which levers to pull with those political leaders, and we can control the evolution of of internal political dynamics and the struggle for political power that may unfold in a circumstance like this. And I think that's, of course, as the experiences of the United States in Iraq tell us, it's nonsense. We can't, as outside powers, we can't do this. And I should hasten to add, from a normative perspective, we shouldn't be trying to do it. I don't think that countries like the United States, should be monkeying with the internal politics of other countries. It's just a bad idea, and it's an even worse idea to murder other countries' leaders, completely contrary to international law. Of course, the Israelis have been busy doing this for decades, murdering, government officials or murdering political opposition figures. Thinking that this was somehow going to make them safer, so.
Right. And also talking about Americans, we are in a situation where America is at war and it costs money. And considering the fact that there is a ruling by the Supreme Court against the trade tariffs that happened. Considering that fact, how are the Americans looking forward or looking at this whole situation where U.S. might be going to war for weeks, months? We don't know. So how are the Americans looking at this?
It's again, it's a sad statement on the United States that I have to be on a newscast in India where the reporters are asking these vitally important questions. You don't hear this in Western media. The important question, which is, do the American people really recognize that they are at war with another sovereign country? I spent the last couple of days in San Francisco. and bustling, nice communities. And I can tell you, the people are not thinking or worrying about the bombs that are flying with their tax dollars, killing the peoples of another country. In other words, Americans regard themselves today as divorced somehow from the violence that their government and their military is perpetrating on other citizens around the globe. And it's a horrific state of affairs. And I wish there was some way that the United States and its citizenry could somehow become reconnected to this phenomenon. The phenomenon by which I mean is of its military being used as an instrument of violence, serious violence, that is killing thousands of innocent civilians. And so the long-winded answer to your question is that the American people are not engaged in this in any way, shape, or form. They see the gun camera footages that's on the newscasts. They hear this pablum from the Western media, which is absolutely terrible. I can tell you.
Absolutely.
And
Yes,
no,
please go on.
Yeah, it's absolutely awful. So the country's not mobilized for war, which again comes to this excellent point that you made a little while ago about the degree to which the Iranian people are engaged. The Iranian people are under no illusions, right, about war. The lead is falling, bombs are exploding. And when you have one country which knows it's at war, and a country like the United States, 8,000 miles away, which is just oblivious, it means that we in the United States lack the political will to really become engaged in the war should the war drag on, as it invariably will. Wars and conflicts, I don't care what they are, who they're between, they're attritional in nature, and the outcomes are more often than not determined by the political will of the antagonists, as opposed to the great equipment and the fast airplanes and the accurate missiles. It's the political commitment of the leaders and the people to the cause. You can ask the Taliban leadership, right? You could go to Peshawar and you could say, well, what were you guys talking about during all those years when the United States was sitting in Kabul and these places? You know what the Taliban leadership would say? We knew that the Americans were always going to leave. They did not have the staying power. So again,
understood.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Of course, I totally understand your point there. Of course, we'll have to wait and see what happens and how far this war goes, which according to Trump is weeks and maybe Israel probably more. But thank you so much for taking out your time and coming on the broadcast and giving your perspective.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure. Yeah.